All right, let's get into it. Today, we're going to be talking about Marxism. Interesting topic, isn't it? I've been reading the Communist Manifesto. I've never read it before. This is my first time, and it was an experience, and that's about it. It was a great experience. I'm glad I read it. Don't know if I'd recommend it. It's a very short book. I had it e-publication. It was about 34 pages. I believe it's a bit smaller in paperback, only about 27 pages or such. It's quite a small book, and so it might be a small episode. It was written by Marx and a few other people. They all flew in from all over Europe by the looks of it, and they wrote what they wanted to achieve in society. They wanted to change the way society was. They weren't happy with the way society was. They weren't happy with the makeup of society, and they weren't happy with the way we were organising our governments. And they wanted to change that. And so they wrote a book. They called themselves communists, and they wrote a manifesto about what they were going to do, and then they published it, and there we have it. Now it's quite a well-known book. It's been influential. I think most of you will hopefully know. It's been quite influential in Russia, and in China, Cambodia, Vietnam, and various other places. And it's been quite popular recently in the West. I've just recently finished a undergraduate Bachelor of Arts, and most of the lecturers quoted him in one form or another within their courses. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And if you watch right-wing commentary, a lot of the institutions in America are quite Marxist, and in Europe. So it's quite large in academia, and that's interesting. So I guess we'll unpack it a little bit. And what is it actually talking about? Well, they start with a very simple proposition, which they believe is axiomatic. That just means it's self-evident. It needs no further analysis. It just is as it purports to be. That's an axiom, self-evident principle or proposition. And that proposition is that throughout all of history, there were two classes of people, and they were continuously in struggle against one another. And those classes were the ruling class, your kings, your queens, your emperors, your feudal states, your oligarchies, things like that, and your ruled class, your peasants, your slaves, and those were the two classes. And that's still alive today, they believe. We're still in a class struggle between ruling and ruled, and he calls it oppressor and oppressed. Whoever is the ruler is the oppressor, and whoever is the ruled is the oppressed. And if you're the oppressed, you're obviously worse off, and those are the good guys, basically. That's what he said. Within the first page or two, the oppressed have always been fighting for freedom, as it were, and they have a moral right to do so, to liberate themselves, because they're being ruled by the rulers, and the rulers of living a good life, apparently, and succeeding off the backs of the hard work of the ruled classes. And that's how it was throughout all of history, and it's continuing today. And it's continuing today in the form of capitalism. That's what they believe. And so Marx was writing in the 1800s, I believe. Quite sure that's when he was, 1800s, and we were industrializing quite quickly then. Manufacturing was becoming more efficient, automated. It wasn't as automated as today, but it was beginning. There were murmurings, and Marx wasn't too happy about that. And so he created a term for these people who were leading these ruling class, and he called them the bourgeoisie, or the bourgeois. And the ruled, the oppressed people, he called the proletariats. And that's how he perceived it. All of history, two classes, and that's still alive today. But it's more pernicious today because capitalism has generated a new format for their oppression. It wasn't just outright slavery or feudal states commanding control of the populace by force. It's a bit more implicit, subliminal, subversive today, as it were. The oppressed people may not be aware they're oppressed because the capital has done such a good job of tricking people into believing they're getting ahead. And it does that by paying them a wage labour, whilst also allowing them to consume the things that they manufacture. And so we're doing this, it was happening at a larger scale in the 1800s. It was beginning to. Railroads were being laid down and such. And the means of production were becoming global and industrial rather than local. And Marx observed that and said that's wrong. We need to stand up and remove those people. And so he developed a theory of what the new world would look like. And it involved essentially seizing the means of production from these bourgeoisie capitalists and redistributing the capital in a way that he saw fit, or that the communist state saw fit, and it was going to be more equal, he believed, more equally distributed amongst the people, because a very small amount of people were leaders of all the means of production, and they were making most of the capital, and they were either hoarding it or reinvesting it. And either way, that was not good in the eyes of Marx. And so he wanted to seize control. So quite interesting. Basically, what he says was, we'll just complete the circle. So all of the capital was being produced by these small amount of people, the capitalists, bourgeoisie, and he said that wouldn't occur without a social element. Okay, you had to socialize the people to in order to manufacture anything, because you required manual labor in order to do so, even though that they're industrializing it, a lot of it's automated now, but more or less you still needed people to work together in order to build the capital for the people who held all the capital. But the capital was privately owned. So Marx said, let's just complete the circle and we will seize control of the capital as well. And then it'll all be socially, it'll be still a social construct, but it'll be socially owned as well. And so that's what he wrote a list, writing explicitly, saying explicitly what he wanted society to look like. I've written it down. The abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. A heavy progressive or graduated income tax. Interesting. Abolition of all right of inheritance. Okay. Confiscation of the property of all emigrants and rebels. Centralisation of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank with state capital and an exclusive monopoly. The centralisation of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. Extension of factories and instruments of production owned by the state, bringing into cultivation of wastelands and the improvement of the soil generally in accordance with a common plan. Okay. Equal liability of all to labour, establishment of industrial armies, especially for agriculture. The combination of agriculture with manufacturing industries. Gradual abolition of the distinction between town and country by a more equable distribution of the population over the country. And free education for all children in public schools. So he wasn't shy about what he wanted. He said pretty well, I think, what he wanted society to look like. And I wondered how much of that was how much of that had ingrained itself in our current societies. Now, as far as abolition of private property is concerned, Marx considered property any sort of capital that was produced, like the revenue that company produces. He didn't consider wages property. He considered the means to generate capital. So he had a very specific term for capital, but for property rather. But the abolition of private property was one of the fundamental tenets of communism. Now, in Australia, You can own land, you can own a house, but if you own land, you do not own any of the minerals on that land. You own the topsoil and the subsoil, and presumably the means to produce agriculture, but you don't own any of the minerals that the land has beneath it. I assume that that's water as well. I didn't have a good look, but I had a brief look. It's definitely raw material like iron, nickel, copper, gold, lithium, uranium. We're quite a rich mineral country. The Crown owns all of that by default. If you're a farmer or you own a bit of land, you don't own the earth under it. Used to be, apparently, that you owned everything beneath you as far as you could dig, and everything above you as far as you could reach. Not so in Australia. State owns the minerals by default, and you need to pay them to dig it up. So they get a royalty basically from everything you sell. There was a case a couple of weeks ago where a fella was fined $20,000 for cutting down a tree on his property. Because the tree was important somehow. But for whatever the reason, he owned the land, but not that tree apparently. And he cut it down and he was fined $20,000. In New South Wales, all over the country, but New South Wales recently, the farmers are being encouraged, that's a word, to put windmills and solar panels on their property, either for a small subsidy payment or by force for the networks, electrical networks, the infrastructure, the corridors they call them. It's a funny euphemism, term corridor. Corridors seem to be quite small, but if you ever look at a renewable energy corridor, it's larger than you can possibly imagine. It stretches many, many kilometres across the country to connect the grid to these remote solar and wind energy sources, and they're being forcibly put on farmers' lands. And so that begs the question, how much do we really own our property in Australia? Because if you're being fined to cut down a tree, that you don't own that property. The title might be in your name, but very clearly none of the other rules of what ownership means apply to you. And so if I was to pour myself a coffee, a delicious slow roasted coffee, but it was dictated to me the terms of how I was to have it. Perhaps I'm not allowed to have sugar in it, or perhaps I have to have a certain milk. Perhaps the mug needs to be held a certain way, or it's not allowed to have a handle. Whatever the case, that coffee is not mine. The terms of me having it in my hand and how I use it are being dictated by external factors. Not chosen by me. And so that's not my property. And so it is with the Australian government and the farmland. The farmer owns the land, but he's not allowed to cut down the trees on his property. He's not allowed to build a dam in some cases, or build a bridge over a creek in some instances. That's occurred here in WA. Or he's not allowed to dig for minerals, certain minerals. He's not allowed to dig for uranium, for instance, even if he owns the property. And if he does dig, because there are resources that he is allowed to dig, he doesn't own those resources. He needs to pay the government to dig those resources. But he has to still take on all the liability for generating that mine. He's got to buy all the equipment to mine, all the shovels and the panning equipment. I'm just being facetious, but you get what I'm saying. He's got to buy all the equipment and he's got to market it to a buyer and he's got to sell it himself. But the profits go to the government. Mostly. So, interesting to see that abolition of private property and sort of how property is held in Australia. Should we do another one? Let's do another one. A heavy or progressive income tax. A heavy, progressive or graduated income tax. In Australia, we've got one of the highest tax rates in the world. It's at 45% at the top end. Most people aren't charged 45%. It's a very small percentage, but it is one of the highest in the world. And I think, I don't know tax law well, but you get a small percentage free for the first, up to a threshold that you earn. And it changes depending on the remuneration you have each year. And then you get taxed quite a bit, and it's quite large, and it's quite substantial. And that's interesting. Marx argued explicitly for larger income tax. Australia has one of the largest income taxes of the world, which goes to the state. And by state, I mean a government body and not the states and territories. That's different. Should we do another one? Let's do another one. The centralisation of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. In Australia, the telecommunications company are completely privately owned and competitive. And competitive is an interesting word because there's only 3 telecommunication companies: Telstra, Optus and Vodafone. That still means it's competitive though. It's still competitive. Fine. The internet's not. National Broadband Network is the only network available for internet infrastructure. We have competition with Starlink, but I think most people still have NBN. It's completely state-owned. all of the quote-unquote profit goes to the government, the revenue, which is probably used to maintain the infrastructure, most of it. Fair enough. But the internet is how we communicate mostly. I barely use my phone to message and call. It's mostly on the Wi-Fi that I message my woman and other people. So communications in the hands of the state. Transport's interesting. You can't have a state mandated control of transport if you have private car ownership. But all of our public transport is state owned, and electric cars are interesting, which they're trying to push in Australia. They're incentivizing car yards to bring electric cars into the country. They get a subsidy of some form, I believe, if they bring a certain amount in each year. Doesn't matter if they sell them or not, but they just have to bring them in, which means purchasing them from the car yard's perspective. They got to purchase them from the manufacturer and bring them in. They get incentivized to do so. Electric cars are interesting because you can turn them off remotely. You can fiddle around with them remotely. Maybe you can do that with the new internal combustion engines as well, with all of the electronics that's in them. But if it has a Wi-Fi connection in the car and it's run electrically, you can fiddle with it remotely. In Queensland, last summer, the government throttled a whole bunch of air conditioners in, I think it was Epsom. Don't quote me on that, but it was in one of the suburbs. And I believe in other parts of Brisbane. Remotely, they throttled a whole bunch during high peak periods because they couldn't handle the electricity distribution on the grid, because they've turned off all of their electricity infrastructure that can be activated instantaneously, like coal and gas. Most of it's reliant on, not most of it, they're trying to push solar and wind, which is intermittent and requires a lot of battery infrastructure to store the electricity. Okay, you can't just turn it on when you need it. You have to store it somewhere, which is expensive. And it's also expensive because you don't get to dictate when and where you have it. You have to wait for the sun to shine and for the wind to blow. So it's expensive. And because of that, the grid couldn't handle the baseload, and the government remotely mandated that the electricity companies, they might even be state-owned, they're state-owned here, turn them off, throttle them. And so I wonder whether they can do that with the cars as well. That's a touch conspiratorial, but it's not far-fetched to sort of proffer that as a proposition, that might occur in the hands of someone willing to wish harm on others. And so in Australia, all forms of communication, i.e. the internet, is state-owned, just as Marx wanted. And they're heavily incentivising vehicles which can be remotely controlled, potentially, throttled by the government. So that's interesting. Should we do one more? Let's do one more. free education for all children in public schools. In Australia, 64% of, I've written this down, this is great. 64% of students attend public schools in the primary and secondary years. 46% go to private schools. Now, out of those private schools, excuse me, out of those private schools, 60% of the funding of all private schools come from some form of state subsidy, whether it be tax exemptions or financial aid. 60% of the funding comes from the state, i.e. the taxpayer. So 64% of schools are state controlled, and by state I mean political government body, not the states and territories. State controlled, 64%. 60% of the remaining private schools, 60% of their funding comes from the state, i.e. the taxpayer. And so if you're a private institution, you might own the school privately. The state doesn't own the school, but all of your funding comes from the state. So by what measure is it private? This is the similar sort of conversation we had about private ownership of property, where the terms of how I have my coffee are dictated to me elsewhere. And so I would imagine that a lot of that funding comes with strings attached. I've had a look at the curriculum. There's a lot of political motivated education in there regarding non-native English speaking students, Indigenous students, the position that Anglo-Saxons are supposed to have towards those students, and the curriculum's not, parts that I've read anyway, they weren't built or written to teach students how to be competent in those subjects. They were written to teach students what they should believe about the current political sphere in Australia in relation to those subjects. And so education is state controlled, as Marx wanted it. Combined agriculture and manufacturing, we don't have any manufacturing left. But like I said, the agriculture is, I think there are 19 drivers of industry, and everyone needs some form of government subsidy now because the regulations are too tight. There's less competition. There's more monopolies. Wesfarmers is one of the biggest corporate structures in Australia. There's very small amount of companies who mine all of the minerals. It takes 16 years to build a mine because of the regulation, the hand-holding, the Indigenous preambles, the hoops, legal hoops, and the price that goes along with it. Education's heavily subsidised. We covered that. 19 drivers of industry, all heavily subsidised. And I suspect if those subsidies stopped in as it currently stands, a lot of those businesses would fall over, because the subsidies have arisen as a result of regulation. And so businesses can no longer afford to operate unless they get aid from the government. And because the government gets a lot of profit from the mines, it can afford to, and from income tax, it can afford to give out those subsidies. But we can bracket that off. Whether, that's good or bad is irrelevant. That's just the way it is at the moment. And so I've been reading the Communist Manifesto and then looking at the Australian policy, and not far off, if not here already. And again, good or bad, wrong way to assess it. It just is how it is. And so there's a lot of criticism in the current media, academic sphere, that we are still a resistance class as Marx had envisioned, and we need to stand up to the rulers, the bourgeoisie, and that they are still exploiting us. But I'm not quite sure how that's the case in Australia, because yes, there's still some capital that's privately owned, but they can't operate without state mandated funding. Some of them are completely state owned, as I've outlined to you. The income tax is high, education's state controlled. And so I just wonder how much of a real we should be angry at capitalists type scenario we're in. I don't think it's the case. We seem to be in more of a Marxist society at the moment, a communist one, as he envisioned. Just as a cursory observation about the policy that's in Australia and the laws that are here and how we're told to operate in relation to those laws, they're quite synonymous with the propositions that Marx put forward about how we should organise our society. So that's interesting. And I mentioned we're a resistance class. That's how he profited. He said that the ruled class, the proletariats, the oppressed, we're a resistance class and a minority, in the sense of we have very little compared to all the capital owned by the capitalists. And we were fighting this resistance, and it was a moral right or a duty that we should stand up to it, apparently, to resist the struggle, the class struggle, and we were to overthrow the ruling elite, take all of their capital and redistribute it. And I just wonder, they've done polling surveys on people who work in media. 90% consider themselves left-leaning, prefer state ownership of capital, prefer public education, happy with the income tax. In the academic institutions, well over 60% are left-leaning. They enjoy state ownership of capital to be redistributed as the state sees fit. Public education for all, state-owned education. Means of production seized by the state. Okay, that's your academic institutions. Teachers, large portion of them self-identify as left-leaning. Happy for state ownership of means of capital, means of production, and the redistribution of capital amongst the citizens. The political sphere, the Labour Party and the Liberal Party have quite left-leaning policy, which I've just outlined to you. Marxist policy, state ownership, state involvement in people's lives. They're both quite happy that that's happening. And after COVID, during COVID, a lot of the corporations began to advertise in ways that were political. And the political leaning was to the left, advocating for public ownership of things, public redistribution. And so we believe, if you're a Marxist, that you're in the sort of minority resistance group who needs to stand up to the elite, the majority, the capitalists, the private ownership, the mum and dad cafe owners, the exploiters, as it were. But all of the media, the political parties, the teachers, the academic institutions, the corporations which require state-mandated subsidies, are all left-leaning and Marxist. So I just wonder which of the classes are the oppressor and which of the oppressed. And we'll just leave it there. That was the Communist Manifesto. I read it. I wasn't emotional. 2 years ago, I probably would have got upset about it. Maybe even a year ago. I didn't get upset reading it. I thought it was interesting. I don't agree with it. I don't agree that that's how we should organise our society. I don't agree with the propositions he put forward. But that wasn't the point of this video. The point was just to say what he wanted and what we've got now and the similarities between the two. And that was it. Okay, next time we're going to do Gad Sad, The Parasitic Mind. I've got it here. I've bought it. Parasitic Mind. I'm going to read it. And we're going to make a video about it. So, that was Marx. Hope you enjoyed. I did. It was enjoyable to read, even though I disagreed with most of the things in it. And there you have it. The Communist Manifesto. Alive and well in Australia. fairly well.